Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Susan Welton, Senior Marketing Manager at Perficient, and I'm excited to be moderating today's webinar, Aligning Spend and Business Goals with Zero-Based Budgeting with OneStream. Time permitting, we will have a Q&A session at the end of today's event, so please type your questions into the Q&A tab located to the right of your screen, and feel free to do that at any time. Two questions always come up with our online events. Can I get a copy of the slides, and can I watch the recording of the event? The answer to both questions is definitely yes. We will email you with that information on how to access both the slides and the recording following today's event. I'd like to start with a brief walkthrough of the agenda, what we can expect today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers on the call. We're going to have an introduction to about Perficient and about OneStream, little background on our companies. Then, of course, we're going to address that burning question, what is ZBB, and really, why should you care about it? We're going to talk about the traditional approach to budgeting that you're probably all familiar with. We will touch upon the business problem and the benefits. We'll address why OneStream is really different. What makes OneStream such a standout company in this space when it comes to finance and modernizing business processes. We will discuss the different implementation options available to you if you're interested in zero-based budgeting. And as I said previously, time permitting, we will have a Q&A session at the end of today's event. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Terry Ledet and Dave Collins. Terry is a Senior Solutions Architect at Perficient and a OneStream Certified Lead Architect. He's a frequent speaker at OneStream Splash Conference and is passionate about making clients successful. Dave is the Director of Solutions Consulting Global Alliances at OneStream Software. With over 25 years of experience ranging from consulting to education to product management, Dave has a proven track record and is a trusted advisor in analytics and performance management. I'm going to start with a little bit about Perficient, just give you a brief background on our company. Perficient is a public company founded in 1997, so been around for 20 years now. 612 million is our 2020 revenue figure. Numerous colleagues, 5,000 across the US and across the globe, really. But the one thing I really like to point out about this slide, there are two things, is our strong repeat business rate, success rate. And what that really means is that customers continue to come back to Perficient for additional service offerings, whether it's implementing OneStream, or maybe it's we have a OneStream customer that's interested in Salesforce or is interested in doing something with Adobe. So the fact that we have our customers continue to come back to us is always a great thing, and I think it's a testament to customer success and the support that we provide our customers. Perficient's really global in our delivery. We are a global digital consultancy. We really focus on helping some of the world's biggest brands connect with their customers and grow their business. Just going to touch briefly upon our OneStream partnership. We are a OneStream Diamond partner, and to achieve that level of success or status in the partner ecosystem within OneStream, you have to meet certain stage gates, and that's criteria success with number of successful implementations around, say, consolidations and planning as an example, and certain number of certified consultants. Another thing I wanted to touch upon here is just really the number of years of experience of the team. We're talking 19 plus years of experience with CPM and more than 1,500 projects. And again, testament to success is 100% success from a customer perspective. Training, we are one of 3 training partners that offer OneStream training in the United States, and training is conducted by individuals in our practice that have multiple years of hands-on OneStream experience. And we have a state-of-the-art training facility in Houston, Texas, but we certainly also deliver training, especially in today's environment, virtually or on-site are options as well. At this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dave Collins to address the OneStream value proposition. So Dave, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Dave Collins. As was mentioned, I'm Director of Solutions Consulting for the Alliances team, which means I support our partners who support you, the customers. Some great news just a few months ago on some additional funding. Many of you may be aware that KKR invested about $500 million in us in 2019. At that point in time, we were given a valuation of $1 billion, though we're still privately held. As of April, we now have a valuation of $6 billion. What's been different about that for us is that instead of us reaching out to prospective customers, a lot of folks have now been reaching to OneStream to get some insight into solutions around performance management and analytics. So it's been quite busy, which is great. Now we fit into the area called performance management. Notice I didn't use the first letter there. I actually was with Hyperion when we coined the phrase business performance management. I was there for the Oracle acquisition of Hyperion, where we changed it to enterprise performance management. Gartner has always called it CPM, or corporate performance management, but the challenge that I have with that is many times I'll be speaking with an organization in public sector or in healthcare, and they don't really fancy themselves as being a corporation necessarily. I raise the distinction on this slide because we're not an ERP. We don't transact business. We don't run the business at that level of detail, though we leverage that data. And oftentimes we'll bring that grain of data, that level of data, into OneStream to do analytics and other performance management functions. When it comes to performance management, today's world actually is very much like the world that we created at Hyperion. It tends to be very fragmented with multiple applications or modules with a lot of maintenance, really falling into two different categories. Financial consolidation, which can have things like account reconciliations, transaction matching, tax provisioning, lease accounting. It basically is where I report history. So my book of record where I look backward at what has happened. On the flip side, from an FP&A or planning and budgeting standpoint, that's where we look forward, where we create plans, and they can be longer term plans that might be multiple years out with a few key performance metrics that we track. They can also be more detailed, where I'm looking at the plan or the budget for next year, or I'm looking at the forecast, perhaps on a rolling basis for the next several months. We often would tie both subjects together with management reporting or profitability reporting, so we could look by product, by customer. We might want to dimensionalize the data then in that particular case so that we can get greater insight from an analytics standpoint on the various intersections of product and customer and channel, whatever dimensionality might make sense to the organization. And ultimately, we're trying to get the information into the hands of stakeholders, business leaders, decision makers, or those supporting all of that function. And the great challenge is now on screen. All of the lines that you see that force the integration, the interconnection of information, both on a dimensional perspective as well as a data perspective, is the challenge. When I left Oracle in very late 2010, I joined one of the big four advisory firms, and I learned two things. Number one, it's not about the enabling technology. It's about the people and the process. So working with our great partner, Perficient, is important so that you get the best approach to how you should solve for these problems. We're then the enabling technology. We see our place as being very important, and we work with our partners and our customers to ensure their success. The other thing that I learned is that this is hard. There's a lot to do when you have this fragmented solution basis. There's a thought that the cloud will solve for that, and it's a very nice thought. In many cases, the other vendors that we compare to have simply taken their on-premises based solutions, which were fragmented, and created a fragmented set of clouds. So flash forward, OneStream 11 years ago, give or take, was created with one and only one focus, and that is 100% customer success. That's a metric that we live by day in and day out. We were founded by two luminaries in the industry, Bob Powers and Tom Shea, both from the Hyperion and the Oracle Hyperion world. They learned from their experience. It's often like moving from one house, perhaps your first house, to a second house. You do things differently. And so from that experience and from the experience of others that they brought into OneStream, they set about a path to create a different approach to performance management and analytics. One of those differences was to create a much better support infrastructure where 90% of the time we get back to the customer in under 40 minutes with a solution. The approach that Bob and Tom and others within OneStream took has been awarded along the way, and we're very proud of those awards. What they did was essentially reinvent the approach to performance management and analytics by creating a platform single application approach. I don't have the fragmented solution where I have to do all the integrations. Once I bring my actuals data into OneStream, I can do my close and consolidation and all of the components within that subject. I can also move on to my forecast. I can do my budget. I can do planning. I can do all of the reporting all within OneStream, all within that one platform. Financial signaling is really our term for operational analytics. It's the ability to look at information day in and day out, as opposed to what's typical of performance management, and that would be end of month, end of quarter, end of year. It's one thing to look at what's happening today and then be proactive. It's another thing, a much worse thing, to find out 3 weeks from now that something you could have solved for actually continued to be a problem. So by the numbers, again, 100% customer success. We have every customer that has ever joined the OneStream family. We're very proud of that. We now have more than 750 customers. Truth be told, we're close to 800 now. Many of those customers have converted from the big three of Oracle, SAP, and IBM in performance management. And we have a number of solutions in a marketplace. Think of that as like the Apple App Store, where I can download a solution for free. We have a number of great customers, great logos. We also have small to medium-sized businesses as well. I talked a little bit ago about the awards, and the one that's most resonant to me personally is the Gartner Peer Insight Customer Choice Process. It's a way for customers within a given software space to log in, register themselves so they're validated as a customer, and then they provide feedback to Gartner, who then publishes that content. So it's a bit different than Gartner doing the review. It is actually the customer doing the review. And in 2021, actually March of 2021, I believe, for cloud solutions, FP&A, we were ranked #1, scoring a 4.8 out of 5. And 98% of those that provided their opinion said that they would recommend, highly recommend OneStream in the future. Now to us, where we're focused on 100% customer success, we're stressing out about the 2% that wouldn't recommend. And we want to make sure that everyone will recommend and be a reference. From a customer perspective, we have a lot of great information on our website by way of testimonials, both written and video. There are some highlights here on screen. I have a lot of personal experience with a number of these by way of my Hyperion and Oracle experience, and then my 10 years of consulting after I left Oracle before joining OneStream. We have replaced a number of solutions in our space. I mentioned Oracle, IBM, and SAP, but we've replaced others as well. And I think the key point is that we have yet to be replaced by any other solution. Now, why is that? Well, I talked about the platform-based approach, which is quite valuable. We're unique in that regard. We also now provide an ability from a master data perspective, embedded, inherent to the solution. We refer to it as extensible dimensionality. It's a way to vary my dimensionality by other dimensions. So on screen, I have corporate standard, manufacturing, services. Those are entities. I have actuals, I have budget. Those are scenarios. Here's an account structure, just a snippet, a sample of an account structure that corporate might require for net sales with operating sales, intercompany sales, returns, and allowance. I need to capture that same level of detail for manufacturing, but they need a greater level of detail for operating sales, and that's fine. They can actually extend operating sales for their purposes, and services can extend operating sales for their purposes, not really having an impact on corporate. Corporate still goes to operating sales, and operating sales is the lowest level, but we provide the flexibility, the extensibility to extend that dimension by other dimensions. And services, when it comes to budget versus actuals that you're seeing on screen now, they wanted to extend event revenue down to corporate and non-corporate events. The idea here is to provide, to promote flexibility, because this is a real world situation. business units, divisions, departments, entities within the organization are going to have differences. That is a fact. So rather than create a separate application or a separate solution, we simply accommodate that by way of our very flexible, extensible dimensionality. And then when change occurs, and it's going to, we can in turn make a change and have it impact everyone within the application immediately. I mentioned the marketplace of solutions. This is where you can work with the partner to download, configure, and deploy from the marketplace solutions that are productivity based. Task Manager is one of them. It allows you to take advantage of the workflow engine that is part of the solution. We'll talk more about the platform a bit later. For financial close and reporting, realizing we're doing zero-based budgeting here, we extend the solution, the application, into areas like account reconciliations and transaction matching. And for planning, budgeting, forecasting, we have a great one. I'm a data geek. I was a statistics major and operations research as well, quantitative methods. Predictive analytics allows me to leverage historical data to create different scenarios of data going outbound. Now, an important item here, all of these solutions can be downloaded, configured, deployed from our marketplace for free. If you are a licensed user of OneStream, you can use any and all of these tools. You can do anything within performance management and analytics because we don't sell modules, we don't sell applications, we don't sell fragmented solutions. We sell a solution that enables all of performance management and analytics. And then last but certainly not least, we provide the ability to visualize all of this information in a blended fashion, meaning that I can look at my actuals versus my budget versus my forecast versus last year for any entity, for any product, for any customer, all at once, because the information, again, is all in the platform together. Last two bullet points on the screen, I think, are incredibly important. We provide full auditability and transparency. That's key and critical for financial close, especially for regulated or publicly traded organizations. And then we eliminate data latency because, again, we're a data platform as well. We provide the ability to bring whatever level of detail into the OneStream platform that is required for an application area or for analytics in association with it.
So good day, everyone. My name is Terry Ledet, as Susan mentioned. Thank you for attending and or listening to the recording. So today we're going to talk about zero-based budgeting. So what is zero-based budgeting? So really, before I begin discussing that and demonstrating the differences between traditional budgeting and the acronym we're going to use throughout this presentation, ZBB, we want to basically quote McKinsey & Company and read to you one definition of zero-based budgeting. Zero-based budgeting is a repeatable process that organizations use to rigorously review every dollar in the annual budget, manage financial performance on a monthly basis, and build a culture of cost management among all employees. For everyone familiar with FP&A or anyone who's participating in budgets, this may look familiar. Essentially, we start with potentially a prior budget. We have our expected increase. We layer on any new initiatives, which ultimately leads to the final budget. Another approach, often referred to as rolling forecast, we refer to here as option 2, current year actuals plus budget forecast, again, rolling forecast, but again, the same process. We have the expected increase, any new initiatives, and budget. Zero-based budgeting approach, what we're here to talk about primarily today. Business is different because we're not going to start with prior numbers, right? We're starting at 0. And by starting at 0, we're going to start with what's important to the business, also known as business objectives. Without business objectives determined, we're going to go through a process of justifying the expenditures. As we move through the process, prioritization. This is important so that companies can allocate funds correctly to high dollar or even low value, low dollar activities that have high value. As with any budgeting process, whether it was the option 1 or option 2 we briefly discussed, there's a negotiation process and a prioritization. So essentially, the individual proposing the budget works with their manager And then typically their manager may work with their manager, and eventually through this negotiation process, this budget reaches the board of directors. At that point, there's probably more negotiation, but ultimately, once the board approves the budget, we're now at the final budget. So why zero-based budgeting? So a few points. Cost management and accountability. Unlike traditional budgeting, where expenses are typically just increased by a percentage, and senior management, the board, investors are expecting a smaller increase or a decrease in corporate expenses, budget owners go through a process where they're not just going through the motions. If done with appropriate cultural change, those budget owners have a vested stake in the budget because there's incentives as well as accountability built throughout. Visibility. Again, as we're not just going through the motions and we're building a quote, a high quality budget, where we have the ability to add commentary to why we're making this expenditure. This could be as simple as here's the activities the employees perform. It could be why I'm taking a trip, and we'll show some examples of that. Focus. Again, kind of a theme on this slide is we're not just going through the motions if done with the appropriate cultural change. Right, our budget owners are going to be active participants in the process, going through looking for dollars to save, but also where they can possibly invest and improve. Common example, for example, on savings, right? If our sales staff is spending about 25% of their budget essentially doing paperwork, that could be an opportunity to invest corporate funds to reduce the amount of time the sales staff is spending on paperwork. Alignment. Again, we started with the business objectives in the previous slide. Essentially, now we're aligning objectives with planned expenditures. So one example, such as OneStream being a software company, right? They're developing marketplace solutions. They're doing what's commonly referred to as sprints for new releases. A company such as OneStream is going to be aligning personnel with high-value software development to meet customers' requirements. I've alluded to this in the previous slide, but change management is key. I can't stress that enough, having been through multiple implementations over 20 plus years of being a consultant. Often change management is one of the things that's not thought through, or is one of the items that's struck through, essentially lined out on proposals, but it's key for a successful implementation because it's no different than, think of an example of you have a teenager and that teenager's now going to get a driver's license, right? But you have to help the teenager essentially get through the process of learning. And so with the change management, we're going to start with the culture, right? Safety from my analogy, but from a corporate perspective, we need a cultural change, and that's going to be philosophical of why we're doing this. And then that needs to come from the top, the CEO, the board of directors, essentially where we get into leadership, right? This just doesn't need to be another activity that individuals need to do. It needs to be essentially high quality and of value, because if it's just another activity, individuals are not going to buy in. Supporting that cultural change in leadership, we have approach, right? A company could start small. This could be, one branch of an organization. It could be a business unit. Many organizations, whether they're large or small, there's various groups. You could start, possibly, let's say maybe we start with the information technology organization and then we branch into accounting. Adoption, really key here, change management. Adoption, you have to plan for adoption, and really that builds on the other three: cultural change, leadership, and approach. But part of that adoption is being willing to listen and have a dialogue, ultimately communication. So if things aren't working and no one listens, then you're not going to have a good adoption rate, which will lead to a bad approach, etc. Kind of going back up the circle. Governance. Key is we're not just going to implement. we need to manage and govern the process. And part of that to me is that communication. It can be something as simple as, right, we need a drop down that we can just click the items as opposed to everyone typing something in. Ultimately, once we're through the process, we get to reporting. As with anything, if we're not reporting on it, we can't measure it. If you can't effectively collect the information and report on the data, then identifying those opportunities to reduce expenditures and reinvest in the business become problematic. And ultimately, feedback. This needs to be a continuous loop, a continuous cycle, where we're going to continuously improve on the process until we have it as efficient as possible. And also we have, as you know, we're never going to get 100% buy-in. We're never going to get a perfect approach, but we're going to ultimately work to achieving that. So why OneStream and ZBB? As Dave mentioned previously, a few items that we're going to focus on. OneStream has numerous differentiators, but the couple that we want to highlight, 5 in particular: platform, marketplace solutions, relational blending, commentary, and extensibility. And we'll go through and provide specific examples of these as we continue through the presentation. Dave?
So from a platform perspective, actually, the next 4 are a product of having that platform-based approach. So I mentioned early on that we have a platform. I talked about it. You saw words on the screen. Here's a great picture that shows that platform. By the way, the platform is definitely in the cloud. It's a SaaS-based solution, but it can also be on premises. So if your wish is to deploy on your hardware, that's fine. I would have to say that over the last 18 months, I think 97, 98% of the deployments have been in the cloud. The nice thing about our approach to the platform is it is identical in the cloud and on premises. But the platform, again, creates the ability to do many of the things that Terry has been talking about on the last few slides, but it also, from a technology perspective, with the marketplace, which would be, again, solutions that allow you to extend your current application, and the data capability by way of relational blending, and the narrative with commentary, and the extensibility in the dimension structures, all of that was thought through when Bob and Tom originally created and conceived OneStream as a company and as a platform-based approach.
Thank you, Dave. So marketplace solutions, we've mentioned this term a few times, but essentially, as Dave's mentioned, there's 50+ marketplace solutions. And truly, that's one of the value propositions of OneStream, because as Dave said, they're not selling modules. They're selling essentially the platform, and we have solutions. And as an implementer, we have opportunities to improve those solutions that you can download as a licensed customer. We're going to talk about, there are 7 specialty planning solutions, and today we're going to talk about 2 of those. And that's going to be the first 2, people planning and think planning. And we're going to talk about those in the context of how those support essentially zero-based budgeting. One of the features we're going to talk about is relational blending. So relational blending. This is really the feature that sold me on OneStream. About 5 years ago, I attended the Splash conference in Austin, Texas, and I attended a presentation, and it's very similar to what you're going to see today from the people planning perspective, but an individual was presenting, and essentially they were at a cube and they were on a form. And one of the things that always frustrated me from a planning perspective was, I'm looking at the number, but how do I get to the detail that supports that number? So in the context of employees, right, you were always trying to wedge employees, as I think about it, into a cube, and you were always compromised from a design perspective. Well, in this presentation, they essentially showed going from a P&L with, you know, salary expense numbers to essentially within a couple of clicks to essentially the employees. And I was like, okay, that's what I have to do with the rest of my career, or at least for the next several years of my career, that's what I need to do. So I personally kind of transitioned to OneStream over the next 5 years and been implementing it basically since that presentation. But other than my personal story, really this relational blending allows us to plan, allows us to report, and makes everything seamless from a client perspective and from an analytical perspective, where you see we have lines going between the relational, going from the relational table to a summarized cube, but we also have a line going from the summarized cube to the relational table. That is a seamless experience for the client once it's configured. So another thing that impressed me about OneStream, you see here we have some various comments, some quotes that we've provided, but essentially is commentary. One of the other things that is difficult in some of the competitor products that I've worked with is essentially a commentary, because commentary really was an afterthought, at least from an implementation perspective. With OneStream, commentary is a first-class citizen in my mind. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, it's flexible and it's simple to capture comments on a report. It's literally adding what's called annotation, which is being technical for a moment, is essentially just a member in a dimension, okay? But the other part of that being first-class citizen is that we have options. So what occurred in one of the projects I'll be discussing as we move through the slides is essentially we were basically doing multiple UAT, so that, right, we would do a sprint, quick development, show to the client, let them do some testing and provide some feedback. And the first time they went through the process, essentially we heard the comment field is too small, all comments are truncating. Well, that comment field was about 200 characters or so. It was 200 characters. So we talked about it for a few minutes and we changed very quickly, literally in a matter of minutes, the comments from 200 characters to 4,000 characters. The client jokingly referred to this as submitting warranties. And when we did a review of some of the comments, once we received, right, quote, non-test data, essentially there were people typing into the couple of hundreds plus way past 500 number of characters. The second revision we heard was great. It was great that you allowed us to support War and Peace and allow someone to type that or submit it. But for the board, right, so now we're back to the board's needs. As we roll through this process, the board, we need to get a more concise that whether it's the end user putting it in or it's the FP&A team putting that in, essentially we need a smaller comment that we can kind of group things. So very quickly, again, in a matter of a few minutes, we added back the 200 character field. So we ended up with what we refer to as, you know, the summary comment and then the War and Peace comment. Last, extensibility. This is a term used significantly throughout OneStream. If you go through an implementation, the consultants such as myself will talk about it repeatedly, but to really get it to, you know, a quick quote is really providing the right content to the right person at the right time. Whether that's, as Dave demonstrated, essentially having different dimensionality for potentially different businesses or for different types of data, whether that's actuals or budget. That it could be something that we talk about often, and you'll see a little bit of an example of, but essentially workflow. Workflow is essentially built into OneStream. Again, it's another item that's not an afterthought. It's built in, it's part of the process, but that workflow is essentially configured for individuals based upon their needs. So one person may need just a couple of forms to submit data in one report. Another person who has more responsibility or is responsible for managing multiple, we'll call them cost centers, essentially they will have essentially that same workflow profile, but because of their security and how it's configured, they have the option to view all of their cost centers. So briefly, before we proceed to ZBB, we're going to talk about traditional budgeting and forecasting. Here with option one, if you remember from the previous slide, we talked about starting with prior budget. And what we want to show here is a few things. First, we're starting with a blank slate. We're not showing numbers through this presentation, obviously for confidentiality reasons. And the data you will see is essentially just either data that's provided with the Gulfstream reference application by OneStream, or it's data that we created for the presentation purposes. But From a traditional budgeting perspective, right, we could be starting with the prior budget. We could see that prior budget into next year, and at the same time, we could apply an increase. Right, so let's say we're increasing salaries by 3%, all other expenses by 5%. Then that budget owner could layer in, again, those new initiatives, getting us to the final budget. But let me point out a few other things here on this image. All of the blue cells that you're looking at, essentially, that is data that is coming from a different source. So in this client's implementation, essentially what was done was the cells were shaded to provide context and communication as part of their training of where that data came from. So in this organization, they also implemented people planning, which we'll review in the ZBB part of the presentation. But essentially, that was managed by HR. So HR, essentially went through the process of creating the salary budget for our cost center. So that individual essentially had, responsibility at the end of the day, but that buy-in of how those numbers got there, who put those numbers in, how the increases occurred, et cetera, really was part of a process that they were outside of. Anything in white is data they could key in. So you can see here other employee benefits, that was a line item they could key in, as well as bank service charges, et cetera. So this was essentially built upon an operating expense model. Anything in gray was essentially an aggregation point, and essentially anything in that blue or gray individuals were preventing from keying. Next, we talked about the rolling forecast. Essentially, we're building on the same presentation, on the same display we created earlier, but in this case, we've just added actuals. These actuals can be dynamic, essentially based upon what you select for your budgeting. So as you're going from fiscal year to fiscal year, if you're selecting 2022, these actuals could be 2021 just by that selection. If you're doing rolling forecasts, OneStream has the capability to essentially seed your numbers. So a lot of customers do a quarterly forecast. They start with their annual budget, then essentially that annual budget becomes the first forecast, but the first 3 months of the fiscal year are replaced with the first 3 months of actuals. Kind of combining our approaches here, we're going to just talk about what we're going to now refer to as traditional forecasting. But here you can see, here's a brief example where we've added notes to the display that you were seeing earlier. So essentially, we went to the end of the input, added a couple of columns. The first column here is called notes required, abbreviated for brevity, and then we have notes off to the side. The notes required column is a configured column. That could be essentially, we want you to provide a note based upon a dollar value, whether that's a total or a variance. We could require a note based upon a percentage. So if your growth is a certain percentage year over year or year over prior forecast, or the rolling forecast as I refer to it as, that could be a requirement. Or it could be essentially a combination of the two, or it could be some other requirement that your organization has. Again, kind of just continuing through this part as we've combined things, essentially the user interface. So really wanted why that Gartner 4.8, right? I think Dave said 98%. I know OneStream is looking for the 2% who didn't give them, the full score. But essentially the user interface. We can customize, configure the user interface with various visual elements, whether that's radio buttons, as you see here on this view, where these are just radio buttons, or we can have drop downs that provide context. Again, this is the context I was talking about with the workflow profile and security, where this drop down is the same drop down, whether, right, the VP of IT logs in or the accounting manager logs in. But the dropdown knows who the individual is and provides the right context and the right information for that person based on their security. The other thing that I want to point out here is we've added also analytics and reporting to this. So at the end, we have the monthly report. And essentially, that really completes the circle from a traditional reporting perspective, where the individual, by having the same access, we now provide them their monthly reporting that they can now review their numbers. Zero-based budgeting. So zero-based budgeting, as we've talked about, we're going to be enabling and justifying our expenses. The two organizations that this presentation was essentially kind of derived and built from, the majority of their expenses, approximately 70 to 80% for both organizations, was people-based. So, and obviously we're going to start with employees. In OneStream terms, it's called people planning, but I'll kind of use those terms interchangeably. But simply, people planning, right, is the marketplace solution that enables managing, budgeting, calculating, and transferring and reporting on individuals. The screen you're looking at here, this is just the out-of-the-box presentation, but a few things to point out is as we go through this, we're going to have a consistent look and feel of the marketplace solutions. Same icons, same toolbars, kind of same visual in this section here of what we call the register. Other things that occur in a people planning implementation, just to be brief, is essentially we create calculations, which is the calculate button. Those are done on a different screen that typically is restricted because we don't obviously want anyone doing calculations. But those are items such as, right, your FUTA and your SUTA taxes, your 401k, you know, all those things you think about if you look at your pay stub need to be calculated. That data is then presented on the next tab, which is called plan data. And so essentially what the plan data is doing is taking those calculations that you've configured in your application based upon your business, where you operate, et cetera, and then breaking those values out into monthly amounts. This data is ultimately loaded to a reporting cube in this example. But the other thing that we did in this presentation that you'll see is we applied essentially the people and we leveraged those into Think Plan, which you'll see in just a slide or two. Also built into the marketplace solution is plan analysis. That's this tab here. Plan analysis has multiple tabs. So one tab, and then you now have options to select other tabs, essentially analytics and reporting. You can see here I've selected the plan reports tab. That plan reports tab provides multiple reports that you can then select, and then they have parameters that you can then pick. And now one selection becomes a second selection, which is then gets you to essentially 5 selections with multiple ways to report on that data. If the analytics provided with the marketplace solution do not fit your needs, you can extend it and add additional reporting. And you can create those as part of an implementation, or if you have the skill set in-house, you can do that. We have a brief example here, which is the export register that was added. Essentially, the export register was just an option, and this client's request was essentially they wanted the export to be the exact same order as the screen you were looking at basically 2 slides ago, where we had essentially the employee. So they wanted their export to be in the exact same order. So that was a very small, quick ask and a win for the client. Transitioning to Think Planning. One of the things I mentioned is essentially we have the standard user interface. You can see here on Think Planning, we have the same layout. Instead of people register, we have Thing Register. We have plan data, plan analysis. So exact same 2 titles here on those tabs, but you can also see here consistent UI interface, consistent features, again, consistent layout here on the register screen. So why are we talking about people planning and Think Planning? In this particular implementation, because employees were a significant part of their expense, and because they were using zero-based budgeting, the ask was essentially, please communicate as part of having the salary expense, what does this individual do, right? And part of that was essentially also prioritizing those expenditures. So again, as what we're talking about here in this middle section with the oval from before, essentially we have business objectives, we have expenditures, and we want to prioritize those. So what we did was we created essentially a personnel process, which had multiple steps, and we'll walk through those, but those were called the personnel activity master, personnel input, and essentially personnel input related. The personnel activity master, that was a mechanism to allow the customer to essentially key activities once and then apply those to employees. Here's just a brief example where essentially, along with also creating the activities, they would have the ability to group them. Here's the activity. And then essentially here they could prioritize it. So that's our prioritization coming in. And then justification for expenditure. Here we have our funding existing as one of the options. Priority was high, medium, low, and a drop down. And then the activity type. What type of activity is occurring? Is that a valuable activity or is it not a valuable activity? That's just one way to think about it, but they had more criteria than that in theirs. Personnel input. On this screen, essentially, we're leveraging the employee information you saw before. So in this implementation, we configure the thing planning register to essentially import employees, whether that was add new employees, delete employees if they were removed from people planning, whether that's for a transfer or leaving the organization. Once that data was essentially updated and employees were imported, we then assigned an activity to it. And you can see here, these are the activities from the previous screen: monthly forecast, ZBB management. Because every employee essentially needed to be 100% from an activity perspective, essentially there was reporting built in after the activities were keyed to that you could either report or determine what your exceptions were from a 100% perspective. Personnel input related. Not every expense is going to be related to a specific employee, at least when you're budgeting it. So, for example, these could be items such as, employee morale. As the owner of the budget, you have employee morale. You have let's say you have a lump sum that you can spend based upon that negotiation process, but you don't know when you're going to spend it. You don't know who you're going to spend it on. So you needed the ability to put in expenses just at kind of more of a group level. The personnel input related was one of the enhancements from the customer's existing process, and we also integrated the personnel activity master with that. The other thing that you can see here that we haven't seen before, but here we included a start month and an end month as part of that, and you'll see that on another slide, but essentially that gave the client the ability to negotiate those expenses. So let's say you needed to save 50,000, you budgeted something for 100,000. You had the ability to change the start month from 1 to 6, and you could very easily reduce those expenses. From 1 to 7, and very easily reduce those expenses in half. As we've now basically completed at a very quick pace our personnel expenditures and have justified those as well as prioritized them, we're going to move to non-personnel expenses. And the non-personnel, you think of your typical profit and loss statement categories. We have travel, entertainment, professional services, etc. Okay, and these can be configured based upon your organization. Brief example here: travel and entertainment. Essentially, with the travel and entertainment, one of the things you typically can't do from a traditional budgeting process is explain easily to the person reviewing and that you're negotiating with what those expenditures are. So at a very granular level, right, you can see here, we're explaining what this trip what the travel and entertainment expenditure is for. And essentially, we're also including the number of trips, the expected spend, the number of FTEs, trip duration, that's the number of days, etc. And we also included a status whether it was approved or not, because that was key to the negotiation process. Just briefly, professional services, facility expenses, two of the other items I mentioned. Here, we just had a consistent look and feel as we went through the process, and the individual would go through their workflow. Not everything was required. So if you, for example, some cost centers did not facilitate the expense, they did not have to fill those in. The other item that is kind of included here, we forgot to put the drop down in, but essentially this expense category was pulling cube data. So essentially we queried their cube, which is a dynamic drop down, and from there they could pick any of the facility expense accounts that may pertain to their cost center. Now that we've completed our planning, our ZBB process, we turn to integration and reporting. As I mentioned previously, we have reporting built out through the solution. Briefly, some of the reporting that was created, a very simple but highly effective report that we refer to as expense summary. That essentially just summarizes the expenses that have been input, as well as provided the full-time number of employees at the end of the year. Expense detail, probably exactly what you're thinking, but essentially a very detailed, essentially recreating that expense register data, that you saw previously, but putting it into one report. So instead of having to go through 6 or 7, and in this customer's case, they had effectively 10 different registers, essentially combining all that data together and into one report. Then to meet the needs of a PowerPoint presentation actually, and to kind of jumpstart that process, we created what we call the expense ranking, which was essentially a hybrid of the summary and the detail options. Essentially the hybrid took the employee data at a very detailed level, gave us the activities that were being spent, and it was activity focused, along with the commentary, which is where that shorter commentary came in, and then essentially provided the summary from the other expense categories. Briefly, the data flow, because I want to save a few minutes for questions. I see we're running close on time. But essentially, data flow, we got people planning, which was integrated with thing planning, which then is ultimately integrated, which was referred to as OneStream stage, which essentially is then pushed to a reporting cube. We didn't picture this on here, but this is bidirectional, so we could go from the reporting cube all the way back to people planning. Integration. Briefly, if you've seen a OneStream presentation, you've probably seen this before, but in this implementation, the import queried all that register data that I was referring to, summarized it, or took the data from that plan data that we were talking about where there's calculations. But essentially, all that was brought in with one click. That's the load and transform you see here. Then essentially that data is validated, so we have data quality in OneStream built throughout the process. And then that data was essentially loaded and processed to a queue, which is effectively the process of that data consolidating. Briefly, a couple of reports. In this implementation, a waterfall chart was created. Essentially, we have our total ZBB expenses in the first column. You can see here, this is personnel expense. Again, as I said, it was the majority of their expenditures. But then we also provided, because everyone loves numbers and grids, we provided the ability, if you click on any of the charts, any of the bars on the chart, I should say, essentially the grid with all the numbers was presented with a percentage. Next reporting option briefly, because different visual, we did a donut chart, but in the top left, that had the ability to break it down by category, so you could see essentially one category if you chose to. But that donut chart was supported by essentially the same grid in the bottom right, in the bottom left-hand corner that made up the numbers. To the right of that, we have the operating expense by funding type, and then the detail of the operating expense funding type by those expense categories. So in summary, why ZBB and OneStream? Ultimately, zero-based budgeting should be focused on the individual, and OneStream is the integrated platform developed with the individual person in mind. With the capabilities of OneStream, the user experience can be tailored with dashboards, forms, and reporting, making the implementation yours, not yours wedged into the model of someone else. Essentially, you're creating an application and a process and making it yours. Having discussed 2 of the 7 specialty planning solutions, which, as we've mentioned, are 2 of the 50+ marketplace solutions, we've talked about thing planning and how we can leverage both relational and cube data together. Throughout, we've talked about workflow, essentially providing that process and commentary as we walk through the process. And if everyone remembers, we talked about commentary being the first-class citizen and warranties.
Thank you, Terry. I would like to open it up for questions now. If you haven't had an opportunity yet to submit your questions via the chat window or the question tab that you should see there, go ahead and do that now. Looks like that we have a couple that did come in already. So in light of our time here, we might only get through a couple, but I do want to let everyone know, if you go ahead and submit those questions, we will certainly have someone get back to you after today's event. So Terry, first one I see here is from Jared. He wants to know, how long does it take to implement ZBB? Sounds like a good question.
That's a great question. So I don't want to give you the standard consulting answer, but it depends. In the implementation I was talking about, they had previously implemented people planning with Perficient, but their implementation required about 14 to 16 weeks for about 2.5 headcount. They had an existing process that they had built in Excel, which wasn't working for a variety of reasons. But essentially, we went through their existing process, made improvements to it, and went through multiple layers of testing and implementation.
Thank you, Terry. So we have another question here. Actually, we have quite a few from Darren. Darren, in light of time, we might only be able to get to a couple of your questions, but I'll go ahead and address one of the ones that came in here most recently. How do you derive drivers, unit-based costs as a foundation to generate a ZBB?
Great question. So some of the other marketplace solutions that we haven't discussed, there's a sales planning that could potentially be used. We probably have to talk about that in a little bit more detail to give you a more thorough answer.
Sounds good. And I think we can maybe just squeeze in one more here. It says, can you centralize the management of ZBB to assist customers if and when needed?
Excellent question. So one of the things that when we went through the first round of requirements that no one thought about was essentially centralizing the management. So we had basically, as we kind of went through that process, we got to a point where the administrator was like, well, how do I manage this? And we're like, oh yeah, we need to work back through that. So that was a very small change. We added to a workflow. There's an option to those registers that I was talking about in the marketplace solutions for thing planning and for both people planning to allow that individual to centrally manage it. And then we added some additional reporting, which was based on the reporting we had already developed. I gave that individual the same drop downs, but with different items in the drop down to provide that flexibility.
Thank you, Terry. And with that, it looks like we are at the end of our presentation today. And I did want to mention one more thing. If you're not familiar with OneStream Splash, it is the annual conference that OneStream holds, and it's taking place in August. It's toward the end of the month. So if you don't have any plans yet for that time frame and you are interested in learning more about OneStream, this is the best place to go and learn so much. There are wonderful technical sessions that are available, and you will have an opportunity to network with fellow peers in the Office of Finance and really get a real true understanding of OneStream and the value that it brings. So with that, I'm going to close today's event. I want to thank our speakers. Thank you so much, Terry Ledet, for your time today, and thank you, Dave Collins, for your time as well. We really do appreciate it, and we hope to see you online in the future. Thank you.